Mata, 10 years old. Miranda Mathis, 11 years old. Eva Morales, teacher for 17 years and mother of one. Alithia Ramirez, 10 years old. Annabelle Guadalupe Rodriguez, 10 years old. Meta Rodriguez, 10 years old. Alexandria Lexi Rubio, 10 years old. Layla Salazar, 11 years old. Jayla Nicole Saguaro, 10 years old. Alejandra Elijah Cruz Torres, 10 years old. Rogelio Torres, 10 years old. From Buffalo, New York, Roberta A. Drury, 32 years old. Margus D. Morrison, 52 years old. Andre McNeil, 53 years old. Aaron Salter, 55 years old. Geraldine Talley, 62 years old. Celestine Cheney, 65 years old. Hayward Patterson, 67 years old. Catherine Massey, 72 years old. Pearl Young, 77 years old. Ruth Whitfield, 86 years old. Zara Goodman, 20 years old, was injured but not killed. Jennifer Warrington, 50 years old, was injured but not killed. And Christopher Braden, 55 years old, was hurt but not seriously injured. Jesus wept. I could say amen and leave the sermon at that, and I might need to. The names of 31 beloved children of God viciously murdered, and 3 more injured in the span of 1 week. Not to mention Dr. John Chang, who was murdered, and the 5 others who were injured in a church shooting in Orange County, California. And friends, I know you hate to hear politics from the pulpit, but despite the inherently political nature of these events, this isn't about politics. This isn't about elections or candidates or parties or red versus blue or conservative versus liberal. This is about human beings, children and elders, slaughtered at school and at the grocery store. This is about hate. This is about evil. This is about hurt and grief and pain and suffering and how we have been here before, and unfortunately we will likely be here again. This is about children not unlike our own. This is about shoppers, not unlike each and every one of us in this sanctuary today. But this becomes a political issue, doesn't it? Every time. It becomes political because those in power refuse to do anything. Because those who have the ability to change something would rather make excuses. Because those who can, with the taps of a keyboard and the swish of a pen, prevent this from ever happening again, would rather hang on to their wealth, their power, their positions of authority, and yes, their guns. Can you tell that I'm angry? Because lawmakers value their money and power over the lives of children, conversations about how to prevent schoolhouse massacres become political, and that stops us from talking about it, doesn't it? Because these events have become political, most preachers will probably avoid the topic. Maybe they'll mention it in a prayer. They'll pray for the victims. Most dinner table discussions and neighborhood conversations will skirt around it. But as followers of Jesus, who said, "Let the children come to me," who said, "Love your neighbor as yourself," who said, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me," we're talking about it. I'm talking about it. Because 19 children are dead. 19 children won't be home for the summer, won't swim at their pool, won't go on vacation to Disney World with their families, won't run through the sprinkler in their backyard, won't enjoy the first good peach of August. We have to talk about it. Because if we don't, we guarantee it will happen again. And we can have faith, right? We can hope that it won't happen to us, or our children, or our parents and grandparents. We can hope and have faith that it won't happen in Dover. But what is actually preventing it from happening? And don't get me wrong, I believe in the power of prayer. I wouldn't be a pastor if I didn't. But as your pastor, let me be very clear. Thoughts and prayers don't do any good if they don't move us to action, to response, to do something, to change something. Prayer is meant to open us up to an invitation from God. And maybe, just maybe, that invitation is, in the words of Jesus from John chapter 18, verse 11, "Put your sword back in its sheath." Maybe the instruction from God is to, in the words of the prophet Isaiah, beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. In today's context, Jesus would be saying to Peter, "Put your gun back in its case." Isaiah would be telling the people, beat their guns and their weapons of war into gardening tools. Turn instruments of death into instruments of life and sustenance and provision. But America has chosen to worship at the altar of the NRA, to foundation idols out of the AR-15s, to worship the golden calf of the Second Amendment, instead of worshiping at the altar of God, who across all major world religions, not just Christianity, commands us to love and care for one another. And because we have made that idolatrous choice, 10 parents and grandparents didn't make it home with their groceries last weekend. 10 parents and grandparents won't get to see their babies grow up. Won't be a church picnic this summer. Won't make it to their hair appointments or gossip with their friends at lunch. Won't tend their gardens or read the next book on their list. And again, I know you hate hearing politics from the pulpit, but we have to talk about it. Because this is something Jesus would talk about. Buffalo demonstrated that racism and white supremacy are life and death issues in this country. Uvalde demonstrated that police, good guys with guns, and active shooter drills are not enough to keep our children safe. And let me again be clear, I don't care if you own a hunting rifle. I love deer meat. I don't care if you hunt. I don't care if you sport shoot. I've done it. I get it. It's fun to shoot at targets, and it's a stress relief to go to the range. I don't care if you own a handgun for self-defense. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about military-grade weapons that are designed to obliterate the flesh of an enemy, do as much damage in as little time as possible in the hands of civilians who use them against children and elders. Many of you are veterans. You know the power of these weapons. You know the horrors of war. It should not be okay with you that this killing power can be in the hands of just anyone. And as followers of Jesus, we are taught and we have chosen to accept the commands to love one another, to care for one another, to work for the flourishing of every human being, all of whom are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God. Every child who was massacred inside Robb Elementary School was made in the image of God and was a beloved child of God. Every person murdered in Tops grocery store was made in the image of God and was a beloved child of God. And as hard as it is for me to accept it right now, both shooters were made in the image of God and were beloved children of God. So as we acknowledge our callings and the belovedness of others, it should not be okay with us that this keeps happening over and over and over again. It should not be okay with us that it's easier to buy weapons of mass death in some places than it is to access health care, alcohol, congestion medicine, cars, planes, the ballot box. Heck, marijuana is less dangerous than guns, and it's still legal in most places. And now that I've told you how I feel about weed, I should probably start wrapping this up. And in all honesty, I'm so saddened and angry I could ramble all day. And I don't want to do that to you. So in the interest of leaving you with some hope, remember what we've learned about Revelation. John was writing a subversive message to those who were suffering and oppressed, those who were tired of injustice and violence and death. And his message was to stay strong in your faith, because ultimately it will work out. Ultimately, God's good ways triumph over the beast's ways. And remember that the beast is a symbol of the Roman Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and the argument could be made that it's a symbol of America today. Ultimately, God's good ways will triumph over the beast's unjust and oppressive ways, the beast's ways of violence and death. Ultimately, God, who is the beginning and the end, will not let injustice and evil and those who perpetuate it go unpunished. Ultimately, God will bring the unjust rulers and the idolatrous kings of the earth down from their power, and goodness and mercy and the righteousness of the Lamb shall reign. But Revelation is not just a message to sit tight and stay strong. It's a message designed to motivate its audience to action, to work for the ushering in of God's kingdom, to participate in God's transformative work of making the world new and better and more life-giving. So in the midst of our despair and our distress and our grief, don't lose hope. Don't give up on justice and grace and mercy and love. Don't give up on the beautiful things of the world and the delight of precious moments. Hug your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. If you're lucky enough to still have parents or grandparents who are still living, tell them you love them. Cherish those you love. Because a trip to the grocery store can mean they never come home. And then act. Work for the vision that John presents in Revelation of open gates, flowing water, fruit-bearing trees, an inclusive community where evil is no more. Call a right to your representatives. Vote in November, sign petitions, donate what you can. Do what you can, what you're called to, what God is inviting you to do to love your neighbors. And I just preached a politically charged sermon. And I expect that I've upset some. But I will never stand here and tell you what to say to your representatives, who you should vote for, how you should petition, or where you should share your resources. But I will interpret the scriptures for today's world. And the scripture scriptures reveal to us a God who values life over weapons, children over wealth, elders over individualism, love over hate, care over violence, flourishing over despair. And the scriptures reveal to us a God who calls us to value the same. Do with that what you will.